Okay, so without any more delay, let's hand over to our next speaker, Breanndán Conchúir from IBM, making high-performance computing essential to the formulation industry. I hope Breanndán will start off by correcting my pronunciation of his surname. So, Breanndán, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. So my name is Breanndán Conchúir in Irish, or probably the easier version is Breanndán O'Connor in English. So I'm a research staff member at IBM Research Europe, working in Daresbury in the northwest of England. So that's a location near Warrington between Liverpool and Manchester. So the title of my talk today is Making High-Performance Computing Essential to the Formulation Industry. And this is very much the mission or mantra of the chemistry team, which I'm part of. So before I dive into the work, I'd just like to let you know that all of the work which you're about to see was performed as part of a collaboration between IBM Research and Science Technology Facilities Council. And this collaboration program, the Innovation Return on Research program, was funded by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Sorry, I'm just having some technical difficulties. So just to give you some context. So as I mentioned, while we are based in Daresbury in the northwest of England, we are very much an international and multi-laboratory effort. So our tech lead, Michael Johnson, actually sits in the Dublin lab, along with our colleague Vasilis. And we also have colleagues Bill Swope in Almaden in the west coast of the US, as well as Kirk Jordan in our Cambridge lab, in the east coast of the US. And of course, I work in Daresbury along with my teammates James and Alex. And we work quite closely with the chemistry team located in the Hartree Centre from STFC. So that team is led by Rick Anderson. And we work with colleagues such as David, Andrew, and Ardita. And we also have a number of academic collaborators. So we have Professor Tom Peters from the University of Connecticut. We have Alessandro Patti and Flor Sipestein from the University of Manchester. We have Dave Palmer from Edinburgh. And we also have Ben Goodyard, as well as Jonathan Doy and Ard Louis. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what this is a TRL barometer, or technology readiness level barometer. And this describes how applied or fundamental any particular piece of research is. So for example, TRL level 1 is the most fundamental academic research one can do into a scientific phenomenon. And a TRL level of 9 is basically when you're bringing an industrial product to market. And our focus is very much in helping bridging the gap between these extremes, and particularly between TRL levels 2 and 6. That is between a level where the technology concept has been formulated, perhaps from academic literature, and to bring it up to TRL level 6, where it's been demonstrated in relevant industrial environment. So over the last few years, we've worked with a series of industrial collaborators, and our research goal is very much to produce computational results which are representative of their experimental measurements. And the business need for this is threefold. So first of all, it's about producing better, faster, and cheaper means of product development. This is very much about identifying premium products earlier in the research and development process. And secondly, it's about deepening a company's fundamental scientific understanding of their products. And through this information, they can help design better, technically better products, as well as producing cost savings in their processing. And finally, it's about developing for sustainability. So a company may wish to reformulate an existing product in order to make it more eco-friendly, or perhaps in response to governmental regulation. Or perhaps variations in the supply chain have made particular ingredients more expensive, and they may wish to reformulate as a result of that. Now, computational chemistry methods have been around since the 1950s. So the question has to be asked is, why have they not been used more in the industrial research and development process? So, for example, if we look into the areas such as civil and structural engineering, we can see how the introduction of computer-aided design in those fields revolutionized study there. And we believe part of the reason why they're not being more widely used in the chemical sector is related to how they're currently being employed. And that is shown perhaps on the left-hand side of the slide here, where we have a typical configuration that you will see in many large chemical companies. So you have an experimentalist who speaks to an in-house computational group about a particular scientific problem. They go off and run a series of simulations on a supercomputer, process the results, produce data and analytics and graphs, and return the result back to the experimentalist. But this type of configuration presents a serious barrier to small and medium businesses that simply don't have the resources to support such a configuration. So we believe a more amenable solution is shown here on the right-hand side. So in the streamlined configuration, we have an experimentalist who can access via an easy-to-use interface. So that could be, for example, a web browser or an iPad application, a computational application, or a sort of virtual chemistry experiment, if you will, that they can easily set up and deploy on a supercomputer that can then relay back information to them in an easy-to-understand format. And of course, these computational applications, these virtual experiments, don't necessarily have to be built by an in-house computational group. They can be produced by external vendors. So in many of the virtual chemistry experiments which we've built over the last few years, we've been looking in particular a lot of the time at surfactant-based formulations. And so one of the primary simulation methodologies we've used to investigate these type of problems is a coarse-grained molecular simulation methodology called dissipative particle dynamics, which I'll just briefly introduce here. So the reason why we use this methodology is that it allows us to access length scales and time scales that are relevant for the assembly of surfactants into micelles, but also conserve enough chemical information such that the fundamental physics and chemistry of the individual surfactant molecules are still conserved. And so how it works is shown here on the bottom of the slide. So you group together one or more atoms or molecules into these idealized spherical DPD beads that then interact with one another via simplified inter-bead DPD potential, which is 3 components. So there's a conservative component, which is 2 tunable parameters, namely amplitude prefactor Aij and a cutoff distance or C. And then we have 2 additional components. We have a drag component and a random or stochastic component. Now, before we run any simulation or any description, we need to understand what is the correct set of force field parameters we need, the set of Aij values, to describe the interactions between each DPD entity within that simulation. And the process of deriving or defining the set of force field parameters which are required to run a simulation is called parameterization. So we've spent quite a bit of effort building a series of automated methods to parameterize DPD force fields to experimental data provided by our industrial collaborators related to formulations of interest to them. And this is very important because if we don't accurately reproduce the correct physics and chemistry to describe the atomic interactions, we won't have an accurate, informative, or trustable computer simulation. So this is how it works. So at the top of the schematic here, we ingest experimental data from our industrial collaborators for an experimental observable, which we can also simulate. And then we define the set of force field parameters, which we need to define to describe the interaction between each DPD bead in the simulation. And then we initialize their values with an initial guess. We run the simulations. And then we compare the simulation results to the experimental results. If they're very far apart, then we optimize our initial guess, and then we run the simulations again. And then we iteratively go around in this loop until we converge to a solution which accurately describes the correct physics chemistry for the atomic interactions in the system and is able to reproduce the correct macroscopic observables of the formulation. So we use a variety of both local stochastic gradient descent methods and global Bayesian optimization methods in this optimization step. And using this methodology, we can generate these tailor-made or bespoke models for various industrial systems of interest. So next, I'll move on to give you just a quick overview of a series of virtual experiments which we've built over the last few years. So, okay, there's supposed to be a video playing there. I'm not sure why it's not working. But this is a high shear rheology simulation. So here we have surfactants in a liquid-based formulation. And we apply a simple shear flow to the system by imposing Lee-Edwards shearing boundary wall conditions to the top and the bottom of the simulation box. And we use automated clustering algorithms and time series equilibration metrics to automatically deduce the equilibration point and to produce the micelle statistics, their size and shape distributions, as well as retrieving viscoelastic information related to their stress, shear, and micelle orientation measurements. And we've also built a series of virtual experiments, which are concentration scans. So the premise here is that we measure a material property or perhaps a structural or kinetic property as a function of the concentration of one or more of the constituent ingredients in the formulation. So the one in the slide shown here is a Sol curve. So again, we have a surfactant-based formulation, which where the surfactants assemble to form micelles, and we're varying the Sol concentration in the system. So in the top left-hand corner in sub-figure A, we see a very low Sol concentrations. We have small spherical micellar structures, and we have electrostatic repulsion between these micelles, which inhibits further aggregation. But as we put more salt into the formulation, this screens the repulsive interaction between the micelles, allowing them to aggregate, and they produce larger micelles, more worm-like structures before they become branched and produce what are quite sort of exotic amorphous structures, as you can see in the left-hand side of the slide. And this is very important because the shapes of these micelle structures are directly linked to the viscosities of these liquid-based formulations. So using concepts from computational topology, we're able to apply an algorithm to the simulated micelle structures in order to produce mathematical geometric descriptors of the backbone of the micelle structures. And this allows us to characterize the micelle structures better in order to evaluate their evolution as we vary the Sol concentration. And we've also recently completed our work looking at patterned surface absorption. So here we derived an algorithm which defines as a function of 3 parameters a disordered heterogeneous dual component surface, which is composed of hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions. And here on the left-hand side, you can see that we produce 10 of these different disordered surfaces. And then we have Py, which is a disordered parameter on the y-axis, Px, which is disordered parameter on the x-axis, and of course the final parameter is the target surface area, which is hydrophilic and hydrophobic respectively. And we also generated a series of surfaces where we had 2 attractive hydrophobic stripes separated by positive hydrophilic regions. And what we did after generating these surfaces is to run a DPD simulation of a liquid-based surfactant formulation, measure the number of molecules which absorb on the surface. And what we do then is we compare this number for 4 model non-ionic surfactants with varying ratios of hydrophilic and hydrophobic along the molecule. And we compare this to the case where we have absorption on purely hydrophilic and purely hydrophobic surfaces. And then, of course, we weight it by the surface fraction, which is hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So as you can see in the top right-hand corner, for each of these 10 different surfaces, we generally see a marked percentage increase in the number of absorbed molecules relative to the pure surfaces. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that for different molecules at different concentrations, they still generally tend to absorb or not absorb on the same places on the same surface. So by applying a Gaussian blur to the bare surface pattern, we can fit that to the spatial distribution of the localized absorbed molecules, which allows us to, via interpolation or extrapolation, estimate where we believe molecules will absorb when we're introduced to the surface pattern that is being produced. So we also have virtual experiments looking at rheology in confined environments. So on the left-hand side, we have a nanochannel with, again, surfactants in water flowing through it. And on the right-hand side, we have 2 parallel plates, which produce a simple shear flow across the system. And again, we have a water and surfactant-based formulation there. Sorry, I just need to. So we've also produced a virtual experiment looking at ternary phase diagrams. So this is very important for formulation because if one wants to do this in laboratory, one has to perform hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments. So what we've done is we've built an automated computer simulation that can detect whether or not at the various concentrations, here we have water, methanol, and toluene, whether we'll have a mixed or phase separated system. And this way we can calculate or estimate where the phase boundary will be using computational methods. And we've also built a virtual experiment which is a little similar. So here we have 3, on the right hand side, we have 3 different non-ionic surfactants in a water-based formulation. And here, by varying the concentrations of each of the constituent surfactants, we are measuring the predominant shape characteristic for the small micelles which are formed in the system. And we're also starting to look into the area of biosurfactants. So this is also very important in order to produce eco-friendly and sustainable formulations. So in order to begin our research in this area, what we're doing is we're running a series of MD simulations to rank different existing electrodynamic force fields in order to compare the simulated results for sugars relative to the real experimental results. And we're also looking to the area of nanoparticle design. So this is designing functionalized nanoparticles for controlled delivery mechanisms, so we can produce exotic morphologies and investigate their different transport properties. Now, of course, none of these virtual experiments are of any use unless they can be easily accessed and used by people who know their formulations the best. So we're talking about bench chemists who perhaps have been in a company for 20 or 30 years, who know their products better than anybody else, have perhaps half a dozen rules of thumb. But of course, they're perhaps not very highly skilled at running computer simulations or anything like that. So we've done quite a lot of work in building consumable software such that they can access the full capabilities and potentials for the virtual experiments which I've just described. So what we've done is we've built an iPad application. So this allows users to key in, after opening a virtual experiment, key in the ingredients of interest, specify their concentrations as well as some perhaps environmental parameters. And then they can press a button which starts an experiment, so that automatically sets up and deploys this virtual chemistry experiment on one of our IBM powered supercomputers and relays back in real time via easy to understand graphics or plots or whatever are the results as they come in. And in order to enable this, we've built a workflow which efficiently orders and runs the different codes which are required in order to complete these virtual experiments. And recently, we've been doing a lot of work on porting these and building these virtual experiments natively on IBM cloud-based systems. So over the last few years, we've been quite fortunate in that we've been able to work with a number of industrial collaborators. So we had a blog out a few months ago describing a collaboration we had with Unilever, where we had an industrial focus group where bench chemists from Unilever were using our iPad application and virtual experiments within them for a number of months. And they were able to provide us with expert user feedback as regards the usability of the iPad application, as well as further information about the type of things that they would be they're looking for. And we've also recently completed a collaboration with Johnson Mayhew, and they were particularly interested in looking at virtual experiments for formulating polymeric systems. So to summarize, our main mission is to help build a computer-aided formulation ecosystem. And this is composed of three distinct components. So first of all, we have the consumable interfaces themselves, which allow non-experts of high-performance computing to access the virtual experiments which we have built in easy-to-understand format. So next, we have the parameterization servers. So here, this automatically ingests experimental data from industrial formulations and then trains a model to accurately reproduce the correct physics and chemistry within this formulation in order to produce the correct, or to compute the correct macroscopic observables or material properties of that system. And finally, we have the computational applications themselves. So this is composed not only of the workflows themselves, but also the state-of-the-art encoded within the virtual experiments. So finally, I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions which you may have.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Breanndán, for what was a very interesting talk. There's two questions have come in on the chat, so I'll take them in the order that they came in. So the first is from Mark Taylor, our previous speaker, who is asking how long it took to set up the micelle simulation and what were the problems that you had to overcome.
Well, actually, there's quite a few micelle simulations in there. So, you know, when you say set up, I mean, running the sort of the DPD simulation itself and setting up and running is pretty easy. And I mean, a lot of academic groups do that, you know, and use these computer software programs day to day. What is a lot more sort of involving is building the sort of automated workflows and figuring out how to build the individual modular, what we call components or bits of code, to make them as modular and reusable as possible, and sort of hook that up into the whole ecosystem, which includes the parameterization server and of course the consumable software.
I see that. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Maybe that's something that you can discuss with Mark further on the chat as we go on. So another question that has come in on the chat is from Mark Brewer, who's asking, is it possible to try the iPad app?
Well, I'll have to ask my boss. I think we do look for feedback about, I think, all three aspects of the sort of triangle I showed at the end there, and certainly we are open to industrial collaborations, and also, you know, basically learning about how we can make this ecosystem better and getting like more use cases. So I guess like for different companies and maybe different sectors, individual virtual experiments will obviously change and we build new ones sort of correspond to different products. But the whole sort of parameterization server, the base workflow, and the consumable bit, you know, can be reused as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. So another question coming in asking whether the consumable software will work both for emulsions and suspensions.
So the consumable software is agnostic of the software simulation program itself. So you can slot in at the back end, you know, you could put in, you know, you put in a LAMS program and a molecular dynamics program. You could put in use a lot of them are dissipated particle dynamics programs. You could put in CFD simulations. The consumable software is completely agnostic of that and doesn't really mind. The only reason that we were showing predominantly, I guess, dissipated particle dynamics simulations in this presentation is simply that has been perhaps the most amenable to the precise kind of scientific problems that our industrial collaborators brought to us. But you know, on other projects which I'm not describing here, we're using other methodologies such as you know, quantum chemistry. We're looking at you know, molecular dynamics simulations that are not coarse-grained molecular dynamics simulations.
I see.
So we're quite amenable to using different methodologies. So I don't see any impediment in the consumable software part that would stop.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a flurry of questions coming in now, but in interests of time, Breanndán, maybe I'll leave you to respond via the chat if you'd like. So let's thank Breanndán once again for a very interesting talk as we switch over to our next speaker. Thank you, Breanndán.